So first of all, Irina, thanks for picking this paper. I found it to be very interesting because I think these are questions that we all kind of think about. And as I was telling the others, so Michel Brignon, he's online right now as well. He is the chair of the committee at McMaster University right now, where we're actually, our task is to evaluate the state of course evaluations right now, and then come up with recommendations, right? Yeah, so I don't know, does anyone want, I thought of a few different questions, and I'm sure Irina probably has some brilliant questions, but do people just want to maybe chime in initially with their just initial thoughts on the papers or anything that they want to raise, and then we could go into some specific discussion questions that we came up with as well. Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
Oh, sorry. I actually, just to provide some context, because I'm really not sure, I know the paper mentioned that teaching evaluations are used as a measure of faculty evaluation, at least in the United States. I'm just wondering if someone can provide some context for what it means in Canada. Like, what is the Canadian context in terms of how these evaluations are used currently? And I know, Joe, you just mentioned you're on this committee to assess evaluations. I'm just wondering, what is the Canadian context?
Well, I could give an answer, and then maybe others could join in, but I think it depends on what your position is. So at McMaster, I mean, there's different people that teach. So there are classic research-focused tenure track positions, and I would say for them, teaching evaluations is more like a pass or fail. Like, you can't be terrible, but I wouldn't necessarily, a person in that position would be advised, I would invest all of your time and energy into this, because the most important thing you're going to be evaluated on is your research. And then we also have a position that I have, which is a teaching track position, where more of your evaluation is based on teaching. So then teaching evaluation scores become that much more important. And then there are also part-time sessional and recurring instructors, where for them, I would say it's really important. So if you get poor evaluations, you might not be invited back. Michelle, I don't know, or anyone else, do you have other thoughts?
I fully agree with you that, and also there's a big difference between the evaluation of teaching for tenure and promotion purposes. So that those are the big decisions that are made twice in a career, and for these decisions, students evaluation are only one component of the teaching evaluation. So that there are also their peer review, which means the peer evaluation. So your colleagues come to your class, a lecture, and they attend the lecture, or there is also your portfolio is also assessed. And then there are the decisions on what we call merit, which is every year you get some points that helps you, let's say, through the ranks. That's good for your career, and at the end of the day for your salary. And I would say for those things, it's, as Joe said, for a tenure track or tenure stream professor, it's mostly pass-fail. So if you get a decent evaluation, that's fine. It may help. Let's say if you have fantastic evaluation, teaching evaluation from the students based on those questionnaires, you may get some extra merit points. And if you have terrible evaluation, yeah, well, maybe that's an issue and you may lose some points, but you're not going to lose your job on that. If you're, as Joe said, if you're a sessional CLA, that's a totally different story. And usually you're not going to have, let's say, a very thorough evaluation each year. It is going to be based on those questionnaire. So they play a very similar role to what is described in the US in the article.
Okay, thank you.
And really important if you're applying for a job. So all job applications will ask for proof of teaching effectiveness, and the official proof of teaching effectiveness is your rating on that scale.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is really spooky, because the way the question, at least at McMaster, from my understanding, is worded, it says something like, please like, how would you rate the effectiveness of your instructor on a scale of 1 to 10? But effectiveness is never defined.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what Michelle, we're looking into right now is that there's many different course evaluation instruments used on campus. So in the Faculty of Science, I think we have one standard one.
Mm-hmm.
Other faculties, they might even differ by department. So there really isn't any standard even within our university.
Mm-hmm.
Except,
Yeah.
sorry.
Sorry. So I've seen some course evaluations for continuing ed because I've done some continuing ed courses here at McMaster. And they're terrible in terms of just even the construction of the tool. Some of the wording is poor and the scales are sometimes backwards. And then students have emailed me later and said that they got confused with the scaling. It's terrible.
I also wonder if this differs across universities. At York, I actually teach in the psychology department, and I have classes of 200 students, 80 students, and I find that, I mean, for them to actually fill out the evaluations is voluntary. So often there's not even a high response rate. So for example, you could have 20 students out of 200 filling out the evaluation, and is that not biased?
It's pretty bimodal when you think about it. The students who fill it out are the ones who love it or hate it.
Right.
Right.
That,
9s or 10s or 1s or 2s. I'm missing the whole middle ground of people who, obviously have an opinion, but not one high enough or, and strong enough to actually
Right.
have a course evaluation. So, yeah, this semester in our class at Intro Psych, we're actually planning on incentivizing them to fill in the questionnaire, basically saying if we get 75% of students, and we have almost 2,000 students in the class, if we get 75% of you filling out the course evaluation, then everyone gets a bonus point on the final exam.
oh, wow.
Yeah, because we're getting ridiculously low numbers of people.
Yeah, we get about 25 to 30% completion,
Sometimes.
which is very high
Yeah.
in our faculty. Most of the evaluations since we moved to online,
Right.
I'd say they're about probably 15% or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's pretty low.
Yeah, we're trying to do something just because we want to know, right? Like we want that middle ground of people, and we want their opinion. At least then we can know that what we're getting on our evaluations is at least somewhat accurate for whatever it is that they're evaluating.
So this is like this is a interesting thing that Michelle and I just talked about yesterday. So our course has actually experienced very high course evaluations over the last several years. And one of the things we're curious about is if we had 75% of the class doing it, how would that affect our course evaluation scores? I'm actually really interested to see what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because I also agree that I think it's mainly the extremes that choose to participate, but maybe in our case, it's the extremes that are happy that are participating more. I don't know.
Yeah.
So if we incentivize 75% of the class participate, I'm really curious as to how that's going to affect course evaluation scores.
Yeah, and then what happens if they go down, right? But then like, okay, from the perspective of the average instructor, if your course evaluation goes down when more students complete it, what is the benefit of you in incentivizing them to complete the course evaluation, right? Like, right, especially if you're a new prof or something like that, and these things still matter, right? Like that's a whole other can of worms.
I think the concerning thing is from reading this paper that professors actually teach in a way that's going to promote good evaluations. It's not necessarily beneficial to the students.
Yeah. Be entertaining, give all your students good grades. 9.5.
And not much work.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I guess we could get into that. What do you guys think of that main, hypothesis being put forward by this paper that instructors are incentivized and either directly or indirectly end up giving a easier course, less work, and high grades because that leads to better course evaluations? Do you think that is what's happening?
I think the evidence that's provided in the paper, it's quite compelling. I think that, and especially I think that what I found really interesting and convincing was the studies where they measure how well students do in subsequent courses. So the correlation between, the negative correlation between course evaluation in one course and the grades of students in subsequent courses, it's 0 or negative in, I think, all the studies. So we're not talking about 200 studies. I think it's a handful of studies, but they all go in the same direction. And that's, to me, that's pretty convincing. And I think that's a really good way. That's a question we discussed also at our first meeting. How do we assess the validity of such a questionnaire? Because I think that the question was raised, what is teaching effectiveness? It's never defined. So it's really hard to assess the validity of something when you don't know what you are measuring. But a good candidate would be how well students do in subsequent courses. So that's why I was very convinced by those studies.
That's also assuming that those subsequent courses are
Scaffold well.
doing a good job, and that they also have like a good, accurate assignment of final grade.
Right, exactly.
Perspective, right? Like if you're asking them to rate, this got me thinking, if you're asking them to rate the effectiveness of an instructor, and a student has a bad grade, right? So they didn't learn the material. Then from the student's perspective, you know, I could see myself going, okay, like I got a C in this class. Obviously, they weren't overly effective at teaching me, right? Like
because I'm
like you know, because I'm obviously
fundamental attribution error, interpsych.
I'm obviously perfect and like the best student ever, and so it can only be their fault. And asking students to have a kind of deep reflection on their own work and their own assessment of how much they put into this class and everything is one thing, and we can do that, but not on a single question on a questionnaire, right? That they're filling out quickly, that they got in their email, that they're just like, okay, I got to get this done.
It takes quite some, good metacognitive judgments to really think about it. So as they mentioned in the paper, you do well or I did well. You do poorly, they taught me poorly.
Yeah.
I can speak to some anecdotal evidence that I've been experiencing over the past year. So I think now maybe like 20 instructors who I work with, and we work on getting midterm evaluations for them. And the majority of opt-in instructors are sessional or CLA. And the biggest concern that they have, and I'm speaking broadly, so it's not blanketing all of them, but this idea of effective teaching, again, going back to kind of the thing I posed earlier, when they think about their longevity in the institution, they are really concerned with the scores they get. And most of them have voiced being concerned around, okay, well, if I give them what they want and the things that they talk about in these midterm evals, it's cutting the amount of readings in the course. It's making the assessments easier, whatever it may be. And if I match what they want, am I giving them the quality of education they deserve? But then am I going to get hired again? And so I think part of it too that we have to consider when thinking about these course evaluations is the timing. So I've been reading some papers around the fact that summative evaluations, when students fill it out, they might even be more upset because the feedback they're giving isn't going to benefit them directly. Whereas when you do it at a more midterm time, you can affect change in the current cohort. Mm-hmm. So that's like something to consider. But again, as well, who is seeking this evaluation? So when we think about our CLAs and our sessionals, they're seeking evaluation on, unfortunately, student satisfaction rather than student learning for the most part, because they want high student satisfaction to be retained. But it kind of goes back to this idea of how well are they actually learning? Yeah. And instructors the sessional instructors really want them to learn. They're really passionate about their topics. They really, really care. They want them to read. They want them to be engaged. But I was just chatting with an instructor who, during their undergrad experience, they had to read like 4 articles a week or so. And they started their course that they designed with 4 articles a week, and students voiced that 4 is way too much. And they cut it down to 2, and 2 is now too much. And they're worried about the quality of learning that they're getting. But again,
No.
satisfaction.
I need someone to read it to me.
Well, no, I mean we have students every year in the course evaluation, and hundreds of them. Like their most common complaint is quiz questions are too hard, right? Quizzes are too hard. It's like, well, our quiz average hovers around like a B- to a B. Like that's a perfectly reasonable place for quizzes to be at. Like that's, not everyone can get an A, right? If everyone got
But
it, then that's insane.
I think my bigger context piece here is it fair to consider the effectiveness of a summative evaluation of teaching if we don't consider as well, like if we say, oh, how effective is this at rating teaching, but we don't think about the broader context of, okay, if we're making sure that it's an effective measure of teaching, is it not going to harm them in the like bigger picture of maybe attaining a job?
Well, I recently got
Effectiveness.
I recently got like my TA evaluations for the course that I take for Ellen here, and generally I'm well liked by students. I'd like to think. So okay, I got high ratings on those points, but what was most informative for me was not the average of all those, like effectiveness, knowledge of the topic. It was the competence.
Yeah.
We do have the other. So for a big course, reading maybe 1,000 comments would be a lot. Excellent.
Yeah.
So for me, it was my comments, like, okay, what did they like? And they actually wrote long comments and mentioned all of the things that they liked that I did. And there's also a comment for, what could have been done better, and I get some feedback there. And as a TA, lots of grad student TAs, they might not want to go on to teaching or not. They might not be interested, and it doesn't matter for them. But for me, wanting to improve my practice, it's the comments that make all the difference, and it's not really the numbers anymore after years and years of TA.
Can I add something to the effectiveness piece? While reading the article, I was very concerned about how do they define effectiveness by saying learning is all about how much content students learned. I think it's not really fair to say this way. It's not about the content that they learned, but if they achieve the learning outcomes that we set for them. So maybe the amount of materials is less important than the quality of things that we offer students to do. Maybe some instructors do offer less materials because they do believe it's enough to achieve the learning outcomes rather than to make them look better. So I would like to look from this perspective as well.
So that, like anecdotally, like I had a high school calculus teacher, and I remember when I was taking the course, there were two calculus teachers, and he was the less popular one. But it was because he was so good. He really actually made us work. He really made us learn. And at the time, like I definitely didn't appreciate it. But then when I got to first year university, I realized, wow, I know this stuff. And a lot of the people around me were struggling. And I thought, I'm really glad I had that calculus teacher as opposed to the other one, right? So, but I think that's something hard to capture, I guess. Like how are you going to collect data on that? Like
the University of Waterloo recently did some stuff on that. They were looking kind of more so at grade inflation in some capacities, but it touches on that a little, where they listed like 10 or 15 high schools in Hamilton where they were looking at grade performance going acceptance rates into university and then how they did afterwards or being in first year. And the results are a little bit scary. You should check it out. There was recently, I think the Spec covered it a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I think I have the article. I can probably send it out.
It was a good article.
okay.
What struck me most about the article was that the many different definitions of learning effectiveness, and really what they were measuring was more consumer satisfaction. It was really a consumerist model. And they didn't seem to have, they didn't include much discussion of how an education faculty would measure the effectiveness of teaching. They didn't talk about course alignment, the effectiveness of assessments. many different measures that could be used to evaluate teaching effectiveness, but they really focused on the consumerist model. And it doesn't surprise me that in these days you're getting less response rates to the surveys, because these days you're getting evaluations from everything. You attend a workshop, you visit a hotel, you take a taxi, and they send you an evaluation afterwards. I'm sure evaluation fatigue is going to set in. So I would think that in the future, you would expect even fewer responses from students about the effectiveness in teaching. The one thing that they did mention in the article that I thought was an appropriate measure of effectiveness was including a portfolio, a learning portfolio in the decisions to, offer tenure or to hire someone.
Well, regarding like the feedback fatigue, one of the practices that we do, like in our tutorials for sure, is that halfway through the course, the TA does a start, stop, continue exercise. So they ask everyone, all their students, write one thing I should start doing, one thing I should stop doing, one thing I should continue doing. And then they take all that feedback and they read through all of them, and then they come up with categories to capture the general trends of what the class said. And then their job is the next tutorial to come back and say, here's what you guys said. So here are the actionable items that will follow from this. And this happens halfway through the course. And I think that really empowers the students. So,
Which is
like, wow, we're going to make a fine-tune adjustment in the second half of this course now that we know what's going on. And I think probably that sets them up to want to give better feedback and maybe complete the course evaluation. I don't know.
I could see that though, right? Because like if I, was allowed to give feedback halfway through a course,
yeah,
and then saw the things that I said actually got implemented,
yeah,
then I would like to give feedback at the end of the course, being like, hey, I'm really satisfied with this. This is really cool. Or if the opposite happened, where I said something, it didn't happen, I'd still like to give feedback.
And
right?
it would be,
either way.
I'm just thinking about this now, but it would be even interesting to give students examples. Like, for example, here's something that students suggested last year, and that's why we do it this way now. Yeah. And like one of the things, for example, that we legitimately changed was how we graded participation in tutorials. Because at first we had kind of, it was totally up to the TA, and then we had a lot of variability, and then we came up with some sort of guidelines, and then we still weren't completely happy with it. We got a lot of feedback, and then I think we're in a good place now.
Yeah, no, we get no complaints.
And we made like a lot of adjustments to our participation grading guidelines.
But that goes back to what I was that I was talking about earlier. So we offer this service at Mac, but there's a team of 5 of us who have to serve the entire campus. So when we do a midterm course eval, an instructor opts in, we meet with the instructor, we discuss, we get feedback about what's your course like, what kind of feedback are you interested in getting. Then we design an online survey and some in-class discussion questions. Midway through the course, around week 5 to 7 or so, 2 people from the McPherson Institute go into their class, the instructor leaves, and we facilitate this online kind of survey where we get some feedback, and then 10 minutes later, we do kind of an in-class discussion, and then following that, we actually generate a report for the instructor, and a week later, we follow up with the instructor saying, here's what the student said, here's this report you can use as documentation of your teaching effectiveness, but also to circle back with the students, and then the following week, they then go back and say, hey, here's what I heard, here's what I can change and what I can't change and why. And it's overwhelmingly loved, but under-resourced. We can't serve the whole campus and do that with every class.
It's interesting, Michelle. I'm glad that service is available again, because when I first started teaching, I had approached to get that kind of feedback, and they had stopped offering that service.
Right now, Mac is one of the only campuses in Ontario that I know of who offers this service. There's some in the States who do it, but again, it's a very time-intensive resource because you have to actually show up to the class, then you have to spend hours writing the report. There's 2 meetings with the instructors. Like it's not resource easy, but it's really, the instructors seem to really appreciate it, and most of the students anecdotally again do too, because they have this space where they have a voice, and then the instructors can make change for the latter half of the semester.
Well, what we did, we had, at the time, there were 2 other graduate students who were teaching for the first time. So the 3 of us, we did that for each other. So 2 of us went to each of the other person's lecture and followed that exact format. So in that sense, it's not utilizing resources, and but you're also getting. And it worked really well for us. We got some really great feedback. The students are really candid in those discussions.
And that's part of it too, right? This understanding that you can implement kind of evaluations, but you have to understand the power dynamics of students feeling comfortable to share authentically.
I agree. I have an anecdote on that, and it's a painful one. So, okay, well, I'll share it anyway. So I'm an economist, and I teach both in economics, but also in a program that's not, well, students are not economists, and most of the students they hate anything quantitative. But as an economist, I tend to teach, and I think it's important that students also can access data and use data, and I believe in quantitative evidence most of the time. So here, in that course, I tried something innovative, and so I wanted to get feedback from students. I ran a very, let's say, amateurish type of midterm evaluation. I simply asked students, what should I change? What should I keep on doing? And so on and so forth. And I got the feedback, and the feedback was change everything from the majority of students, which means don't do anything quantitative. We hate that. And numbers are bad. Numbers prevent you from thinking. So no numbers whatsoever. And of course, I pushed back and said, no, I won't do that. I'm not going to do that. There's no way, because I think it's the content. I decide on the content. And so at the end, where it becomes painful is that at the end, out of 110 students, 40 completed the evaluation, and my final score was 1.
Oh my God.
1. So a group of 40 students decided to punish me because I pushed back, and they gave me a 1. So my chair, because I'm an old professor and I'm tenured and blah, blah, blah. So of course, my chair said, well, what's going on? What did you do? And that's not the kind of scores I received usually. So I explained. And well, yes, so I got a buy on this one. But what I'm trying to say here is, how do we separate teaching effectiveness from content? And I think that's the paper is all about that. So, and at one point, what I'm trying to say here is that it's not always clear for students what is the difference between you're teaching that stuff and you're doing well at teaching that stuff versus I don't want to learn that stuff. And so I'm going to punish you for teaching me that stuff. And the course, I have to say, the course was a required course, not optional. And I think that makes
a difference too. I think part of it is having someone or something, a tool, a person guiding. I don't know if it's guiding the conversation, but redirecting kind of if students are like in a class discussion, sometimes we have students being like, I hate this reading, this like whole unit, this sucked. I never want to do this again. And it's redirecting the feedback to, if they're interested, for our instructors, if they're interested in getting information about their actual teaching practices, saying, okay, we hear you. We hear this unit wasn't so great, but if you had to take that unit still, what's something that could improve the effectiveness of how you understand that material or communicate that material? And that's not a perfect way, and by no means do I think I've solved the problem, but it's having a tool or some sort of piece that really brings students back to this idea of communicating this process of not just bashing, hating content. Mm-hmm. But it's harder said than done, 100%.
Yeah, I imagine somebody who's teaching something like organic chemistry that, everybody freaking hates, even if they like organic chemistry, versus, some easier natural disasters course or something, although natural disasters got harder on that. But when it used to be really easy, obviously the teaching evaluations between these two things are going to be drastically different based on the fact one is filled with kind of interesting, fun weather data, and another one is filled with a lot of stuff that needs to be memorized because you need to know organic chemistry if you want to go into this field,
And I think that we're innately biased to prefer content that we enjoy, but having something to redirect back to the teaching practices, if that's the goal of this assessment of some capacity, is my idea right now. Do I know if it's perfect? No, but it's a start.
So how do we go about doing that when on something that isn't quite as resource intensive, right? Like, we are never going to get 2 people who go
to every class
with every single class on campus. Like, that's an unrealistic expectation. So how do we, bring this?
You could do it peers. So within a department, you can,
like a peer-based model.
If you have something like this, a requirement.
As part of your service as a faculty.
Yeah.
The issue is then maintaining standard, or like eliminating bias, and there's like a little bit of weirdness in there too, in terms of if I went in on a course refinement for you, Joe, and you got slammed, and then I had to provide you this information, are you going to totally take away your animosity towards me? Hopefully, but who knows? We're human, right? So it's a possible solution, but there are some nuances among like faculty cohesion or things like that need to be thought about too.
Care about course evaluations.
Or teaching in general. If they don't have to care about teaching, some people won't.
I'd like to think that most faculty care, but there are definitely some who seriously don't. Who are just the students will have whatever opinion they want to have, and I don't care what it is. I'm doing this, and I'm going to keep doing this.
I don't want to create more work, but one other possibility is that teaching professors within the faculty, maybe this is one of their services, and then maybe you don't even do your own department. Like you do an instructor within your faculty, right? So you don't have to necessarily understand fully the content.
Might be better if you didn't.
Yeah, but you can look at, you can see what's going on and give a objective sort of arm's length view of what's going on in the course. That could be interesting. And because if you get teaching professors doing this, these are people who are more likely to be actually engaged in teaching and have been thinking about pedagogical issues. So
yeah, totally. It's just resource intensive. So maybe they could be like one less course they teach, and then they facilitate a couple refinements for that year, but that means needing more teaching faculty.
Yeah, I don't think you get less teaching, but it could count towards their service somehow.
Do you think then maybe there's already kind of at least from what I feel as though there's a little bit of, depending on the department, feelings between teaching faculty and typical faculty? And do you think maybe if the teaching faculty were the ones who are always providing either good or bad news, that would kind of continue to make that rap feel good?
Yeah, no, that's
it continues the divide.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a program here at York called Teaching Wheels, where teaching faculty actually volunteer to observe each other's classes. So it's not an evaluative process. It's marketed as something that's non-evaluative, but it's a way for course instructors to get feedback on their teaching from their colleagues. And again, it's not, like it was mentioned, it doesn't have to be from your own department. Often it's not, but actually it's pretty insightful because when you don't really know the content per se, you're really focusing on the teaching strategies and teaching skills. So I think that's helpful. It's not counted as service. It's more done on a voluntary basis for faculty who are interested in getting some feedback on their teaching, which I think is, I don't know, it seems a little more genuine. Like if you're genuinely interested on improving your practice and getting feedback like this, it may be better for it to be more on a voluntary basis as opposed to service-based. I don't know.
I can see that, right? Because I mean, even if you get, say, a faculty member who doesn't care, right? So you set this all up and they have to do it or whatever. You're not going to get anything out of it, right? Because that faculty member is still just going to ignore whatever feedback.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but if it's on a volunteer basis, then at least you know that, okay, people are putting in the work into your class and the information will be received by somebody who wanted this information.
Right.
And
from a faculty's perspective, in terms of like tenure promotions, I think volunteering to be in this program should reflect well on you.
Yeah.
And whatever feedback you get, whether it's good or bad, as long as you respond to it. Like you could just write like a 1 to 2 page document, like this is what I got, this is what my reflections are, here are things I want to change. And I think, yeah, and that should just have a positive effect on you. It shouldn't be seen as something that's like punitive or potentially like an inspection.
But I think that goes back to what I don't know if I effectively communicated earlier, that it's hard to think about evaluations of teaching without thinking about the broader context of how they influence people moving up the chain, if you will.
Yeah.
It's so hard to tease them apart because it's unfair depending on what side of the spectrum you're at.
You can say that all you want, that you want this to be viewed as this, but if somebody is now looking at 2 equal candidates, right, and one of them got this really positive evaluation on this, and one of them got this really negative evaluation on this, then, you know, you're going to take the one who did the more positive thing.
Even if the one who was negative was the one participating in this trying to improve their practice.
Exactly. Right? It can be hard to ignore negative data. Like as somebody who's evaluating somebody for a position, like you can say, oh, I'm really happy that they went and did this and everything else. But now you just heard a whole bunch of bad stuff about this person, right? Like it can be very, very hard to not pay attention to it.
I'm being mindful of the time because we have less than 10 minutes. There's a couple of questions I was just really interested in asking. I did want to get across. One was, are student evaluations of teaching valid measures of teaching and learning effectiveness? Right? Can they ever be? Can the actual student ever be trusted to give valid information for evaluation purposes?
I think we'll learn how much they like their professor. Yeah.
But do you think that they are in a position to make this judgment, like metacognitively or otherwise?
So how is it fair in the case where 40 students decided to give a negative evaluation? If that professor hadn't been tenured, that could have a huge impact in his career.
Yep.
So how much power are we giving those students to actually influence somebody's career? I mean, that's scary, I think.
Yeah,
we're giving them a lot of power with no training.
Yeah.
Like I think that's the big
Over your question, like,
big issue here. Students are really bright.
I think that there was something also that I find interesting in the paper is that, and I never thought of that before, but there is let's say the implicit assumption is that there is something called teaching effectiveness, and teaching effectiveness should not vary across audiences. So if you're an effective teacher, you're an effective teacher no matter who you're delivering the teaching to. And they made that assumption when they said, for instance, within class variation is not or indicates that it's not measuring teaching effectiveness, because if there is correlation within class correlation between grades and teaching evaluation scores, it shows that it has nothing to do with effectiveness. And I would dispute that, because you might think that even from one student to the next, you may be very effective to teach to that student, and that student is going to get a very good grade in your class, but you're not effective. Your method, your style, your whatever is not effective with another student, and within the same class, you're the same person, you're doing the exact same thing. It doesn't work with student A, it works with student B. And doctors, for instance, have that with patients all the time. We know that practice styles work very well with some patients and not with other patients. And that's the thing that I was not too, maybe a bit in disagreement with the paper, is that assumption that teaching effectiveness exists. It's a characteristic of the individual, and it doesn't vary at all with context or from case to case. So there might be some idiosyncratic variation, and it's really hard to capture.
I completely agree. Yeah. I actually looked at what date the paper was, because I thought that, I could expect someone expecting that it was universal if it was a paper in the 80s or something. But nowadays, that they're a varied student population, and some techniques will work very well with some people and not others. So.
But then what do we do then? How can we?
How do you capture individual difference?
It's so idiosyncratic. Yeah.
Okay, another quick question. Maybe everyone could just give an answer too. Should universities make the internal course evaluations widely available to the public?
Ooh.
Let's go let's go around. Ellen?
Well, we have ratemyprofessor.com.
We do, but the actual official course
gosh.
evaluations, should they be made public?
Well,
Yes or
we
no?
have to first decide whether they're actually valid. If they're actually
Exactly.
Okay. How about currently?
If not, it's a
Yes or
giant
no?
contest.
No?
No.
No.
No? No?
And I have really good teaching about it.
No.
I think it just goes back to this business model. Like if we're using effective or if we're using evaluations to help improve courses moving forward for students who are learning versus like publicly funding, and that's so hard. In the current state, I say no, for sure.
So at McMaster, it's actually a question given to faculty members. You can choose to make your evaluations public or not.
Seriously?
Yeah.
No, I'd be in favor of making them public, and the reason is that then I think it would happen to those evaluations what happened to many other evaluations in other contexts, that everybody would realize they are biased. The best way to make them biased is to make them public, including the open-ended comments. Because when you read the open-ended comments, that's where you see the bias. So the comments are always much, much, much harsher on women instructors than men instructors. They are always harsher on immigrants than non-immigrants. And so if we should put the material out there so that everybody can see, well, it's useless. The same way that all these other evaluations for restaurants and all that stuff, we know they are useless.
So one database, what's the course evaluations or the evaluations that are public that everyone knows about is Rate My Profs. So I'll post a link to this on Twitter. Some of you already know about this, but someone named Ben Schmidt has put together this database of 14 million Rate My Profs ratings, and then you could put in keywords.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can see how it separates males and females, like how often that word shows up. It's really fascinating. So if you put intelligent, that shows up significantly more for male professors than for female professors. It's really, really interesting to just kind of play around with the data. Just put in any keyword that you can think of, and then you could see how things.
I would say it's depressing, not interesting.
Yeah. I think something to remember too is when faculty and instructors or whoever are reading their course evaluations, they're human. I was just chatting with an instructor who is one of the biggest pros of having someone else go through your evaluations and kind of making these key themes for you and giving it to you is that you avoid all the garbage that gets submitted as well. But it goes back to your point, Michelle, of maybe if we made the garbage public, people would realize it's garbage to begin with.
Yeah, but then I remember I did a start, stop, continue once in lecture, and I received some inappropriate comments from my students.
All the time. All the time.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, right? Like what do I even do with that?
Yeah.
Right? Like
another issue too is that part of the reason why some people want to post on like Rate My Profs or something is that they want to see their comments public like that, right? So if the official course evaluations are public, it's like, oh, there's where I wrote what a jerk he is. Like, look, it's there. Like, I'm sure some people would get off on that too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, interesting. So we are out of time, but Irene, what's the paper next week?
So next week we have 2 papers that we're looking at, so they're not too long, and one of them kind of summarizes a little bit about teaching evaluations and potentially giving us a few points on how we could improve them, and another paper does talk about the bias in evaluation, one of them being the gender bias in evaluation. So hopefully everyone can do both the reading.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll post this video up on the edcog.ca website, and yeah, like if you happen to be on Twitter, I'll post some of those links on Twitter, and if you have additional comments, we can start a thread there. Thanks very much. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.